Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. For today's special, we're going to talk about toxic masculinity and true femininity. Right? As messed up as the true virtue of masculinity has become, femininity has also become screwed up as well. And we need to properly define both again. Otherwise, we're lost. We're lost. We're getting tossed back and forth by the latest of postmodernism and pop culture, never knowing what is true, stumbling and flailing and failing along the way. And we got to do better. I need to do better. And we need to be intentional. That's what today's special is all about. I want to give a quick brief treatise on where I stand on this toxic masculinity issue. It doesn't exist. That's to be blunt. Toxic masculinity does not exist. There is no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's not properly defined masculinity. But there's no such thing as toxic masculinity because masculinity is a virtue. The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are the fruits of the Spirit. There's no such thing as toxic joy or toxic peace or toxic self-control, right? You can't have a toxic virtue. Similarly, you can't have toxic masculinity because masculinity itself is a virtue. So the way I like to look at masculinity, there's kind of two frameworks. The first is Carl Jung's archetypes of masculinity: the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. The very short of this, the king brings order to chaos. And by the way, we're supposed to be all of these, we don't just have one or two, we're all of these as a true masculine male. The king brings order to chaos. The warrior protects the vulnerable. The magician sees through the lies and finds the truth. And the lover sees the beauty in all things. You have the four archetypes, and then you have actually two shadow types of each of these. So you have like the king in his fullness, and then you have two shadow negative parts of like a bad king, right? So if the virtues of each of these aspects of a man are not intentionally trained and maintained, then you by default become one of the shadow types, which is not good. So instead of being the king, right? So a king is decisive, a man of integrity. You inspire others and you bring that order of the chaos around you. If you're not the king, then you're instead a tyrant. You cause chaos, right? Or you're a weakling. You're just amidst the chaos. You're a coward. The warrior, so like think of a triangle. At the top, the warrior, brave, alert, focused, decisive, adaptable, skillful and competent, loyal, disciplined, right? These are all the aspects of a warrior. Or, right, if you're not these things, then you're one of the bottom parts of the triangle. You're either a sadist who's cruel to others, right? You hurt others, or you're a masochist, just a total pushover and someone who likes being the victim. The magician is curious, intellectually curious, smart, reflective, spiritual. And again, it can see through the lies of a deceptive culture. That's the magician. On the shadow, you could be the manipulator, right? So you use your adept powers to hurt others. Or you could be what Jung calls the innocent one. This is the one who does not put the work in to succeed. And because they're a failure, they tear others down to feel better about their own inadequacies. Right? And then finally, there's a great book about this. It's really short. It's called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. I definitely recommend it. It's very quick, easy read. And then finally, the lover, right? The lover is someone who sees the beauty of the world and everything in the world and the beauty in his wife and his kids and just loves life. The little things in life in particular, the simple joys. And the lover truly understands what matters most in life. So that's in his fullness. Or if you're not that, if you don't properly train that intentionally, then you become either the addicted lover who's needy or the impotent lover who doesn't know how to love. And then Jung puts it, in a world of color, you only see gray. You're just emotionally closed and cut off. So it's important to work on living in the fullness of each of these archetypes all the time, or you will, by default, fall into the shadow types. And that's my main point of all of this. We need to be intentional about all good things, right? We've got to be intentional about it. You need to actively go get them. We need to raise our sons to be men. And that's one thing that our culture has forgotten, our rites of passage in America. They don't exist in our culture. They don't exist. we don't have rites of passage where you advance from one phase. There's a great book called Raising a Modern Day Knight. That's it, yeah, Raising a Modern Day Knight. It's all about rites of passage at different ages of a boy's life, right? And right now, like the rites of passage are like you get your driver's license, and a lot of kids say don't even get driver's license, or like first time you have sex, like that's your rite of passage. And you're like, there's cultures around the world, and there's today, and we used to, where you would leave a boy and come home a man, right? There'd be like a distinct, the men in the town are going to engage in this rite of passage for you, a boy. You're going to leave a boy and you're going to come back a man, a new person, no longer coddled by mom. Instead, you're now a man with responsibility over yourself and others. There's a tribe in Africa. The boy goes off. He goes off a boy, and then comes back a man, and he comes home, and his mother introduces herself to him. Nice to meet. Welcome to our home. What's your name? Like, I'm Mary. Oh, nice to meet you. Right? You're like that much of a new person. I'm not saying we have to do that, but you get my point here. Like you come back a new person. We don't have that ceremony. We don't have that intentionality like that anymore in America. And then we wonder why so many men are just like wandering. Right? There's like this meandering, anxious, impotent, drunk on porn and drugs. I mean, they're just like, just whatever. They never had to become a man. Ben Sass has a great book called The Vanishing American Adult, and he talks about adolescence. This phase of adolescence is a new creation. And now we've just continued it forever. Right? You can live in adolescence. It never used to exist, right? You were a boy and then boom, a man. And in America, we created this new thing called adolescence. And it's good. It's good. But it has to end. Right? You gotta stop and then become a man eventually. But we don't. People are in their 30s and 40s and they're still adolescents. That's what C.S. Lewis called. He called them men without chests. Right? Men because they hit puberty, but that's the only masculine thing about them. They're more male than men. More male than man. And then the feminists come in. Right? The feminists come in and they call this toxic masculinity, right? So when all these men, these males are living in these shadow types, right? Feminists come in and say, oh, look, that's masculinity. It's toxic masculinity. No. It's not properly defined masculinity, but we can fix this. And also, if anything, it was the feminists were a major cause of all this, but we could take it all back. So dads, my call to you is to first live it yourself every day, of course. Show it to your kids. But then intentionally raise them to be men. The other framework I like quickly is John Eldredge. He talks about the 6 phases of masculinity. You start off the beloved son. You are the apple of your dad's eye. And then at around 12 to 13 or so, the boy enters the cowboy phase. This is where every boy needs to answer the question, do I have what it takes? The boy asks himself that. But do you give him the opportunities to answer it for himself? Get dirty, do hard work, do dangerous, exciting things. Around 18 years old, the man becomes the warrior, finds his purpose. Because men are made to come through. Got to learn that. Got to learn that muscle, train that muscle. And then around that same time, you're the lover. You got to do warrior first, then lover. And lover, again, not just of a woman, but awakening to the beauty of the world, right? You get a love of sailing, surfing, painting, biking, hiking, whatever it is, you get a passion for it. And then the phase of the king, where you are entrusted with a kingdom. And if you did not properly engage in all those previous phases, then you become a kingdom. You become the king of a kingdom. And you will bring ruin to it, to you, and to the people you're entrusted with. And the story of mankind, unfortunately, is too often the story of men who are entrusted with power and use that power to bring harm to themselves and others. And the reason why is because they never properly lived out those other phases. So if you were never the beloved son, you're insecure. If you were never the cowboy, then you don't know if you have what it takes. If you were never the warrior, then you have no purpose. If you were never the lover, then you're dead inside. and now you're a king. So you're pushed into this position of power, and you're either a tyrant or you're a pushover. Either way, you're failing. And then the final phase of masculinity is in your 60s or so, you become the sage. This is when you invest in kings. Right? You become the mentor. It's maybe the most important stage of all, helping raise up other men to be proper kings. So this is how I think about how I think about masculinity. I think about it through these lenses. So we're going to talk more about them all next. We'll talk about honor first with Grant McCracken, author of the New Honor Code. We talked to him the other day, and he's wonderful. And then we're going to talk about true femininity. Right? Today, feminists say that the way to be a real woman is to be more like a man. The way, like, men need to be more like women, they say, and women need to be more like men. No, that's not it. God made man and woman. Let's embrace this fully. How do we best complement each other? We'll do that next. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to get right back to our special about toxic masculinity. And one thing, if we're going to be intentional and bring masculinity back into our culture the right way, I think this is one of the most important guidebooks to do so. Grant McCracken, he has a book called The New Honor Code, and you should buy it. A simple plan for raising our standards and restoring our good names. Grant McCracken. Grant, good to talk to you again, brother.
Hey, Mike, how are you doing?
Good, a cultural anthropologist by trade. You were just telling me about a football player, and I want to get to him. Can you start off also with one of the men that you write about in your book? Is he a sheriff or a policeman? Just right. As an example of an honorable man.
Yeah, this guy's a state trooper. He says that, so he spends all day pulling people over on the highway. Many of those people are terrified of getting a ticket that will cost them their license. So he says as he walks up to the car, they give off this vibe. He knows what's coming, and what they do is offer him money or sex to get out of the ticket. So every day, sometimes several times a day, he's staring temptation right in the face. And every day he has to say, sometimes several times, no to that temptation. And he's done that over years and years, and it gives him this quality. I was doing this interview, right? I spent my life interviewing people as an anthropologist, and this guy, steely is almost the right word, but it wasn't like he was tough or so macho that he couldn't relate to another human being. He was listening, he was interacting, but there was a kind of poise or posture about the guy that said, do not suffer, just be very careful with this guy. He is to be taken absolutely seriously. He's a formidable guy who has earned the charisma that you now see before you. And it was, again, his construction of honor over several years that you could read in his presence.
What did he tell himself, or how did he build this code? Or did he have an explicit code, or what was the mantra that he had?
His notion, I think, was the slippery slope understanding. He said that the moment he went for one of these temptations was the end of everything, right? That he would never get back on his high horse. So it was a constant daily practice of discipline and caution. And I wonder, it wouldn't be entirely surprising if he'd slipped once or twice. His understanding was to survive a moment of weakness would be extremely expensive and maybe entirely hazardous, right? It may be the end of your honor to get that wrong.
Wow.
You could feel it. He just gave off this kind of something amazing.
Yeah. Tell me about this football player you were speaking of.
So Carson Wentz used to be the quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles, and they paid him an unbelievably large amount of money. And he's failed this season. He's now been replaced by a younger quarterback. And on ESPN this morning, they were scorning him. And that's fair enough. The guy's paid a lot of money to play football, and it turns out he's failed at playing football, at least this season. And so the question is, what sustains Carson Wentz in his hour of darkness, right? When everybody, including people on national TV, are openly scorning you as a football player, You need to dig deep enough to find the resources you need to, and this is kind of that internal honor question, right? You know who you are, you know how you rise to occasions, and it's only that self-possession, an absolute kind of, again, a kind of steely self-definition that allows you to survive for the state trooper, it's temptation. For Carson Wentz, it's the possibility that, in fact, he is now the object of scorn on the national stage.
Yeah. Okay, this is so interesting. So when I think honor, I think external. So I would think like, oh, Carson Wentz is being dishonored by all the clowns on ESPN. But these two stories are internal. So how do you juxtapose that?
Exactly. So I always think of honor as being both those things. It's an internal matter. It's a private conversation with yourself. And you're the only person who's party to that conversation. You're the person who constructs your honor act by act by act. You're the person who has to survive, enjoy the good of that honor to the extent that it gives you charisma and confidence and that, a certain swagger. On the one hand, and you're the person who gets to enjoy the power of honor to protect you against criticism. That's the internal honor. External honor is a kind of reputation economy where you do good things for the community, for your family, for your friends, and you build up a reputation over weeks and months and years in the process. So honor has those two faces. And it's when that external honor goes south on you that you really need that internal honor to sustain yourself.
Am I right in saying that the internal honor comes first?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
And it's kind of a self-respect, right? It's who you see when you look at yourself in the mirror. Did you do well? And did you do well? Were you committed to what you cared about, even when other people didn't necessarily care about what you were doing? Right, there are lots of examples of, in the annals of science where somebody just keeps at some process of discovery, or, the world is filled with people who insisted on making their own way in the world, despite the fact everyone said, oh, that's stupid, that's nuts, that can't matter. And the lucky ones end up in triumph. But it was their internal sense of honor that got them to a public success.
Okay, I've asked you this before, and you answered it, but I want to make sure I get this right, because I hear this and I'm all in. But then I think, okay, well, by what code, right? Because you can make up your own internal code, and it's not a good one, I would say. But then we live in a postmodern world where who are you to say? So my extreme example would be, what if you had an internal code, like, I don't know, like the Unabomber, and my honor is killing as many innocent people as possible. Like, well, but he lived by that code. But let me think of a less absurdum one. What if your code is to sleep with as many women as you can, right? And our culture does, in a very perverted way, lift that up as a point of external praise. So does Leonardo DiCaprio have honor because he sleeps around with models?
Yeah, that feels more like opportunism than it does like the pursuit of honor, right? When you're sleeping with as many women as you possibly can. Like, there's nowhere in any moral handbook does it say you should sleep with as many women as possible. I mean, we could look in Plato and probably nowhere does it say take advantage of as many people as you possibly can, right? That's almost always discreditable, dishonorable behavior almost always looks like what it is. An opportunity for you to serve your interests at the expense of somebody else's interests. So I think dishonorable behavior has a way of tagging itself as dishonorable. It just takes a small amount, and I guess the golden rule is what you can use if you can't tell by your own dint. You just say, would I want to be treated like this? And if the answer is no, then you're pretty certain that you're in fact taking advantage of somebody, and that's dishonorable.
If you don't read your book and think deeply about these things, and my point of the opening monologue was, if you're not intentional, it's so easy to get caught up in our culture, which says it is good to do all these dishonorable things. How do we swim upstream?
Yeah. I think maybe we want to think again. I think we're also in the process now of rethinking the celebrity culture, which really said, it's more important to be famous than it is to be honorable. That in fact, if you have the opportunity to use dishonor to capture celebrity, go ahead and do that. I mean, how many people do we now revere who got to their point on the Mount Olympus by releasing the sex tape or somehow acting in a discreditable way? So I think that's, there's something deeply wrong with a celebrity culture that invites us to think well of people who are, some of them, just bad people.
Yeah. And they're not happy. There's these YouTube videos out there. There's like 5 or 6 of them made by the same people. And they montage all these famous people about happiness. Now, happiness is like an interesting, fleeting, weird thing. And I'm sure as a cultural anthropologist, you have some thoughts on this idea of happiness. But none of them, they're all miserable. And they all thought being famous would make them happy. But every single one of them is like, no, I'm miserable because of this celebritydom. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's that happens when you don't have internal honor. You're wealthy and you're famous and everyone loves you or at least pays attention to you. But when you look in the mirror, you don't see somebody who hasn't conducted themselves with honor. And if you're missing that, then you're missing everything, right? It doesn't matter how wealthy or famous you are. If you don't have that self-respect, you're really done for. And that's,
you mentioned.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, please.
Say we look at how many celebrities fall from the heavens, right? I recently did a list. I came up with 300 people who had been famous and then eventually fell from the heavens. So I think, if you don't have that internal honor piece, you can't protect yourself against temptation, against drugs, against various kinds of abuses, and you will lose even the celebrity piece. Right? Johnny Depp might be the case in point now, right?
Yeah.
He's
Okay. Yeah.
State of freefall.
Yeah, and there's one every week. All right, I got 2 last questions. How do you can you live a life of honor? But there's a worry that you become holier than thou. Right? You think the other people think you're superior than them because you're too good for, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. To go back to that state trooper, I think as he looked across the I was sitting in his home, we were doing the interview. As he looked across the coffee table, I'm sure he looked at me and thought, oh man, this is one of those social scientists, an academic, an intellectual so-called, who's really soft and incapable of discipline and really probably has no honor at all. So that's absolutely the danger is that you will give off sanctimony, right? And when you give off sanctimony, people don't like you. But he didn't. Right? He was just still, almost priest-like in his severity, or at least his discipline. So I didn't feel like I was being judged, but didn't take very long to figure out who I was dealing with and that this guy was formidable, that he had self-created himself to be honorable. So he managed to communicate the key message, which is, I'm a man of dignity and self-possession and honor, without making me feel bad about myself. And God knows, as an anthropologist, I deserve to feel bad about myself.
No, you're right. And there's a genuineness there, right? If he was not really honorable, then there would have been a sanctimony there. Out of maybe like an insecurity or something. You're right. Okay. All right, last question. You mentioned steely, and I'm getting this image of the state trooper and whatnot. How are you honorable and steely, which is a really cool concept, and also have emotion? Because you don't want to be emotionless. You don't want to be cold. You want to be tapped into that compassionate heart. So how do you make sure you still do?
Yeah, I think it's in the face of temptation that you want to be steely, or when you're dealing with somebody who may not get who you are or what you stand for. But I think when you're with your kids, your spouse, your family, that's when you can need to stop being steely and start living with your heart.
What's one masculine characteristic you'd like to see more of in our culture?
Ferocity. Ooh. I love it when people are ferocious. I don't think about it necessarily as an only a male characteristic. I think women can be ferocious. I think they ought to be ferocious. I've seen ferocious women in business and on the playing field. So it's not like, oh, only men can do this. And when we say only men can do this, then it feels like an exercise in something we're uncomfortable with. I think, go to the Israeli army, it's filled with ferocious women who are women and ferocious both without any sense of contradiction. So anyhow, that's, I think ferocity is the key.
That's a good one. The new honor code, you got to go buy it. everyone. Grant McCracken, A Simple Plan for Raising Our Standards, Restoring Our Good Names. Grant, an honor. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mike. An honor indeed. Thank you,
Have a wonderful day. Mike Slater, spread the word.
Mike.
Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special. So we've just been talking about masculinity, true masculinity, intentional masculinity, how that's a wonderful virtue. But as lost as we are in our culture today with masculinity, I think we're equally lost with true femininity, right? We have feminists who have said we need men to act more like women and we need women to also act more like men, and we've lost track of everything. Emily Chashinsky's here. She's the cultural editor of the wonderful Federalist. Emily, how are you today?
Good, how are you doing?
Wonderful, thanks for being here. Let's talk about what femininity is not. Like how have the feminists screwed it up for everyone?
Yeah, so feminists have been on a crusade for the past several decades, actually, to convince women to, as you said in your introduction, act more like men, which is actually, not a bad option for some women who are suited to, perhaps more masculine careers or masculine lifestyle choices. But the vast majority of women, and polling actually bears this out. You can find some of it in Christina Hoff Sommers' excellent book, The War Against Boys. But actually, a lot of women say, even working women say, that their preference would be to stay in the home with their children. And we've created a culture where that's not only discouraged, but it's also sort of unaccepted. It's not the way that modern women are encouraged to live their lives. And, what's even more troubling, I think, is the fourth wave of feminism, which is consuming our culture right now because it's coming down from, it sort of migrated from college campuses into newsrooms and boardrooms and Hollywood writers' rooms, and is now insisting that biology is not essential at all. And that biology exists on a spectrum. So biological sex is not essential, and gender exists on a spectrum. And that's extremely confusing both to men and to women, but it's creating a situation in particular where women are just confused by what they're supposed to want and perhaps what they naturally want.
Yeah, okay. There's so many different places to go. I'm sure you saw the New Yorker cover a couple weeks ago.
Yes.
And it was of like that woman. How would you describe that cover? I want to make sure we saw the same thing. I saw something pretty depressing and dark, but what did you see?
Yeah, I saw the exact same thing, and I do think it was sort of a Rorschach test for people on sort of the far left and everyone else. Because if you're on the far left, you might see that as empowering, and everyone else is really looking at that and seeing it as deeply depressing. And that's a good place to go, I think, to branch into from this conversation, because this is really the world that modern feminism has created for a lot of talented young women. And you could probably project onto that young woman in the New Yorker cartoon, or the New Yorker cover, I'm sorry, a lot of what feminists have wanted for young women of my generation and millennials and perhaps Gen Z to follow them, which is, go embark on this journey of self-fulfillment through your career, live in cities, live alone. And the pandemic has also created a situation where I saw in that messy, really messy apartment, she didn't have anybody, male or female, to clean for, because we're so isolated from everybody else in these times. And so I agree with you. I saw something very dark in that picture.
Yeah, so just for everyone, we don't have it on hand, but it was a 30-year-old woman sitting at her computer, dressed like a slob from the waist down, in an apartment of squalor with cats. But she was looking nice from the waist up, drinking some martini or something. So presenting something for the Zoom camera, but living alone and in a depressed state abound her. And it was, sad. But you wrote a great article about Taylor Swift, which I think is a perfect example of this. And if I get your article right here, first of all, I gotta read this line, it's so good. She's now embarked on an urban journey of self-fulfillment brought about by friends, glamour, cats, and wine. So it's interesting because I look at the arc of Taylor Swift and the cultural inputs that girls are getting, because she started off as something, and I want you to explain that. And she took this path of being the like the feminist urban cat lover. Like she's like the New Yorker cartoon cover. But she could have gone, I'm going to get married, have kids, and write songs about this aspect of what femininity has always been. But she clearly didn't. And she's celebrated for this as opposed to what she could have been. Anyway, speak to that. What do you get from that?
Yeah, I think Taylor Swift's arc is a really representative one for millennial women, many of whom actually grew up with Taylor Swift, and they were getting these really confusing cultural messages. And Taylor Swift's a great example of somebody who was ultra popular, maybe when I was in high school, and was writing these songs that romanticized traditional American girlhood. And you may be able to critique that from sort of a racial perspective. Maybe it wasn't like legitimately inclusive at all of other people, but it was very like a traditionalist mindset. She came up through country radio, and that's another thing entirely. But she came up through country radio, romanticizing traditional American girlhood. There was a time around like 2012 where she became friends with Lena Dunham, and that probably had some impact on her worldview. But she sort of, I think this happens to a lot of young women who particularly come from the suburbs, go to college, and end up having, their eyes open to all of this like leftist thought that is taught to them in college. Of course, Taylor Swift didn't go to college, but I guess maybe Lena Dunham was all the education she needed, and taught to them in college, and they end up sort of discarding those traditionalist notions. And for some women, again, that might be exactly what they're suited to do. But for a lot of women, it probably isn't. And they've been told that they need to have these like high-powered careers. That's one thing I actually left out of that line that you read. I should have added, this is a journey of self-fulfillment that also includes careers in addition to cats and wine and glamour. And that's something that, women my age have been told is necessary to be an asset to society and a valuable woman. And that's just really not the case for so many women who may actually naturally have this inclination to be mothers first, to be wives first. And it's confusing so many different things.
It's a lie for men, too, that your identity should be wrapped up in your career. It's a lie for men. Yeah. I can't understand why feminists thought that it's a good thing for women to be defined by their career. I'm sure you saw, this was last year, but I just came across it the other day, the writer of the original Sex and the City books, last year, she's in her 60s now, and she's like, oh, that was all a mistake. Because she doesn't have any kids now. She's all alone. And she talked about all of her friends who divorced in their 50s, thinking it was their last chance to get a better man or something, and now they're all miserable and they're cubbing. They're trying to find younger men to be with, and they're alone and don't have any kids. Anyway, but it's amazing how many women and girls she influenced with her books, and then therefore the TV show, and the inputs that these girls have received that have sent them down the wrong path. It's sad. So, okay, let's get to some good though. What are some feminine virtues, just period, and then maybe we can decry the urban careerist feminist vision. But if we were to have the feminist vision of the home, which it sounds so weird even saying that, Emily, right? But what are some virtues of that feminine life?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to be clear that I'm not saying every woman should, give up, should not work and should stay barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. But of course, women are caretakers. That's very much a feminine virtue. Women have a deep desire and, a deep desire and ability to take care of other people and to take care of men and to take care of children. And I think everything else is really downstream of that. That's the most important feminine virtue. And we've created, and this goes for men as well, and I'm glad you brought it up, that sort of like to the extent that a career allows you to provide for your family, and I'm not just talking about a family that you create immediately, but also your parents as they age and your brothers and sisters. Men should, of course, value their careers for that reason as providers. But we've created a situation where society tells men and women that their self-esteem should be wrapped up in their abilities to have successful careers. And that actually, I think, undercuts both the essential feminine virtue of being a caretaker and the masculine virtue of being a provider.
Yeah, good. I love this idea of caretaker almost coming first. That's really interesting. So I have we got to run here, darn it. So I got a 2-year-old daughter, and she loves to feed baby Johnny, who's 9 months old. She loves to feed him his bottle and loves to feed him spoonfuls of food, right? And it's annoying because she's not very good at it because she's 2. But I hate to quash that caretaking instinct in her because other good virtues can come from that. So what are some other virtues that come out of the caretaking drive that women have?
That's a great question. Well, so out of the caretaking drive, it would be sort of like creating I'm trying to think of how to describe this. I keep coming to the word taking care of other people because that's really what it all comes down to when I think about it. But creating a space for others, creating a happy space for others, keeping things in order. And that's not something that, but that's something I think the feminist left has kind of taken and created a new version of. So that's what I can think of off the top of my head.
No, that's good. No, but I love that we're going down this path. So, okay, so what I hear you say, I hear like service. I love the word order.
Service. Service is a great word.
Intention has been the theme of the show. So there's an intentionality there, which implies a thoughtfulness. Okay. I like that a lot. That is something to think about. What virtues come out of caretaking? Okay. All right. I love it. Emily Jashinsky, how can we follow you on Twitter and the rest?
Just at Emily Jashinsky. That's where I am everywhere.
Okay. Beautiful. Emily, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Have a great one.
Have a wonderful day. Yeah, true story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So we're talking about toxic masculinity on today's show. The first segment we talked about honor, how to get that back, and just how intentional we have to be to bring honor back into our society. The last segment we talked about what true femininity is. And now let's bring these things together. We live in such a mixed up world where our pop culture says that men need to be more like women and women need to be more like men, and no one's happy, particularly in the dating world, but also in the married world because of all this. So to talk about this, Tiana Lowe is here. She is one of our wonderful contributors here at The First and also an opinion writer at the Washington Examiner. Tiana, how are you today?
Hi, Mike. I'm doing well.
Good to talk to you. So let's talk about the millennial woman. Well, let me ask you this first. The brokenness of the dating world and just you and I are millennials, that whole world, is that caused more by women and women not understanding their proper true role, or is it more caused by, you think, men who are screwed up and not living and acting honorably? Who fails first?
I think it's sort of a chicken and egg type situation, but if I might point out, I blame our parents' generation in large part. We saw how the boomer attitude towards marriage and casual sex just decimated a generation. I can think of a lot of friends I have who don't want to get married because they saw either their own families or their friends' families devastated by divorce because the boomer attitude was just so cavalier towards divorce. So millennials, while we're getting married less, in large part it's because we're getting divorced less. And clearly there is this crippling fear that they're going to enter a marriage as toxic as their parents. And so in that sense, that's not a gender thing. That is our parents' generation terrifying us with the idea of what it means to be in a relationship.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I wonder if you could go back, right? So their parents and their parents and their parents, and how each successive generation has counter-reacted based on the failures of the generation before it. Do you know what I mean? And I wonder what this means for us. Good.
Well, that's why it's so funny that it was the boomer generation, because they were the kids of the greatest generation. And then what did the boomers do with it? They decided that marriage didn't really matter. Infidelity was much higher among boomers than it is among millennials. And then obviously, as I said, divorce. Casual sex among millennials, much lower than among boomers. So now we're sort of all becoming these proto-Japans where millennials just date less. They don't really sleep around. They get married later. It's gotten to the point where now marriage is, if you look at it from an economic perspective, viewed as some sort of a luxury good. Marriage is something that is now a benefit reaped increasingly by the upper classes, not so much by the working classes. That's a huge problem, not just ethically and morally and for society, but financially. We're going to hit a huge social security bubble where we are not going to have enough workers for social security recipients.
Yeah, that's interesting. Gosh. Yeah, there's so many consequences of that. All right, let's talk about the date. I want to come back around to all that. Let's start with the dating world, though. Your friends who are in it now, and so my wife's friends at work and whatever, they just talk about it like it's just like the worst thing ever. And I'm so glad I'm not in it today with Tinder and expectations, and it's just a disaster. It's like, what are the worst parts about it as you see it from your friends?
Yeah, so I moved to DC about 2 years ago. And it's funny because when I lived in Los Angeles before, more of my friends were much older and most were single. And now that I'm in DC, all my friends and me, we're all in long-term relationships. And kind of thank God for that, because whenever I do report back to my friends in LA, dating just does kind of sound like a nightmare now. I'm glad I met my boyfriend the old-fashioned way, through other people. And that's the way that most of my friends all met their boyfriends. Because the world of, we've increasingly turned dating into a commodity, going on in the same way that marriage is a luxury good. People themselves are now commodities. In the same way that you can choose the kind of socks you want on Amazon, the kind of steak you want on Uber Eats, you can now choose the kind of person you want to talk with on a dating app. In theory, I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I do know a couple of people who've gotten married from these dating apps. But it does create a sense that, you should just swipe, what is it when you reject someone, left, I think? You should just swipe the next better option. And so increasingly, I'll talk to people who will use all these apps, and they don't actually go on any dates. Pre-pandemic, I'm not talking about during the coronavirus, but pre-pandemic, because they were always just sort of waiting for the next best thing. And when you're in a relationship, nothing will ever be perfect. You find the person that you click with, and it gets better and better. But no, it's people are now they have these increased expectations of what things should be off the bat. And it creates a sense that will never be fulfilled. This unrealistic just goal that cannot be fulfilled.
Yes, I love that, the commodification of dating. You're right. And then I think of the unfulfilled goal. You have, as we talked about earlier, the fact that our parents were divorced so often, so there's a hesitation there. And then there's this expectation that Hollywood has set of what relationships should be, as you said, right off the bat, right? And none of that's all screwed up. Both of those are wrong. And how is someone supposed to navigate that properly? Gosh, that's interesting. Let's talk about the casual sex part. So I wish I could just call my wife in here and she could rant about this. But her friends who don't have this figured out, they're going on a ton of dates, and they're having sex right off the bat, and then they wonder why the guy doesn't call them back, after the first or second date, and what they're doing wrong or whatever. What do we do with this, right? And this cultural input we have where sex is so casual and thrown around.
So this is one where actually I blame women more than men in some respects. If you tier the data by income, you see that men are the one who are a lot less satisfied with their dating lives and they want more longevity. Women are the ones who are okay with it. And that's fine if you're 35 and if you're in the middle of your career and if you don't mind living the Sex and the City lifestyle at that time. I know lots of women who are happy with that. The issue is when you're 50, when you're past childbearing age, and not everyone wants kids, but the truth is most people do. And so we have seen in the professional classes, women, 10 years ago, it kind of felt like there was messaging, lean in, how to have it all, how to have a husband and children and a career. And now there's been this sort of rejection of the family aspect of it. Now there is this sense of, and we saw this with a lot of the pushback on Amy Coney Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett should be a feminist hero. She really has it all. She has it all. She is she is the peak paragon of a career woman and has this great family. And yet we saw among the left-wing feminist class, but why would you consider it cool that she has kids and a husband? Because she also has a career. So she is a feminist hero. But among women, there is an elite sort of disdain for a lot of that. With men, I am very scared that we are going to see Japan-style social crises. We are already seeing, as it's been aided by these heinous, tyrannical lockdowns, a dramatic increase in substance abuse, a dramatic increase in mental health and suicidality. And I do think, that's been affecting men more than women recently. If you look at the direct correlation between marriage and fertility rates, the consequences have been much more dire for men. Men are the ones increasingly taking to the bottle, doing drugs, killing themselves. And I think a lot of that is caused by loneliness. Men need women, but women also need men. It goes both ways.
Yeah. Last quick question. So I have 2 sons, 4 and 9 months. But I think I have a pretty good handle on what masculinity looks like and want to raise intentional to be that. But I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I'm less concrete on true femininity, what that looks like. So what's a feminine virtue that you look to and point to and think we need more of in this culture?
So I guess I could say something traditional as a feminine virtue. Women are supposed to be more tactile and more collaborative. Like when you look at studies of men and women in business scenarios where they excel, women are better at collaboration, better at bringing people to making deals. But to sort of spin this on its head, it's less about what is a feminine virtue and what is a feminine vice. So if we're going to say what toxic masculinity is, it's not too much masculinity. It's masculinity untethered. Masculinity not guided by morals. We saw this in Hollywood with the whole Me Too movement. That was toxic masculinity, not because it was a presence of strong men, but because it was an absence of strong men willing to point to the Harvey Weinsteins of the world and call them out. Toxic femininity works, sort of the same way. It's femininity untethered. An excess of manipulation, an excess of cattiness, an excess of backstabbing, viewing female friendships as a weakness rather than a strength. So to that, I would say, I guess the feminine virtues would be cultivate your close female friendships and learn to view women as your teammates and not as your competitors. Not using deception and manipulation, because that is something we women are very good at. Using, I guess, your feminine wiles for good and not for bad. That's how I would.
I love that. And I love that answer. It's not the presence of strong men, it was the absence of strong men. That's a perfect line. And just on that friendship point, one of my buddies, one of my single friends, is dating this girl now. And I said, what do you love about her so much? And one of his lines was, she is loved well by her friends. So
that is a huge one. If there are 2 rules in dating. One, if you're dating a girl who just says, girls just don't like me, run. And if you're dating anyone of either gender who says all of my exes are crazy without exception, run. Dump them.
That's awesome. Tiana Lowe, Tiana, T-I-A-N-A, Tiana the First on Twitter. And DC Examiner writer as well. Tiana, awesome to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great day. True story. Mike Slater will do it again. Spread the word.